Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the March 15th, 2021 meeting of the CB6 Housing and Homeless Committee. My name is Corinne Vanderdonk. I am the chair of the CB6 Housing and Homeless Committee. This meeting is called to order at 6:33 p.m. Tonight, we are joined by committee Vice Chair Rich Mintz and Assistant District Manager Cody Osterman. Members of the public, you can raise any questions or comments that you have through the Q&A feature of Zoom. If there is time following the committee's discussion, we will field questions from the public. Members of the public, Anju Suresh has volunteered to take minutes tonight. Thank you, Anju. You should all have received several emails from the board office with a link to a Doodle sign-up sheet for minute takers at your committee meetings in 2021. For your convenience, the link of this committee is also being posted in the chat right now. At the direction of the board chair, each committee meeting must have a designated minutes taker and a designated backup, just in case. To eliminate the guesswork, make sure that you volunteer for as many slots on the Doodle sign-up sheet as you can. If more than 2 people sign up for a particular month, the office will make sure to distribute the duties equitably and will let you know in advance which months you're due to take minutes. If you have not already filled out the Doodle, please do so right away. The link to the sign-up form is currently in the chat, so now would be a good time to fill it out. We will now take attendance by roll call. Cody will conduct the roll call.
Okay, committee members, I will call your name. Please unmute yourselves and say present. Neil Barclay. Joan Berenbaum. Abigail Cruzmark.
Present.
Rich Mintz.
Present.
Anju Suresh.
Present.
Corinne Vanderdonk.
Present.
Jeff Zelen. That's 4 members present, which is a quorum.
Thank you. The agenda for tonight's meeting was distributed ahead of time by the board office and appears on the screen for you. Committee members, if there's no objection, we will adopt the agenda as stated. Members of the committee, if you object to adopting the agenda, you may raise your hand through Zoom. Seeing no objections, the agenda for tonight's meeting is adopted. Committee members, the minutes from the February 16, 2021 committee meeting were distributed ahead of time by the board office. If there's no objection, we will adopt these minutes as drafted. If you object to adopting these minutes, you may raise your hand through Zoom. Seeing no objections, the minutes from the February 16, 2021 meeting are adopted and will be available on the CB6 website tomorrow. And thank you, Abby, for doing the minutes. In order to conduct an efficient meeting, let's observe a few ground rules. No one may speak until granted the floor. Committee members, if you have a question about committee business or wish to make a motion, please raise your hand through Zoom. If you click the participants icon, the participants panel should appear and you should find the raise hand function there. If you still have technical difficulties, you may click the chat icon and relay your difficulty. The chat function should not be used for committee business or questions about agenda topics. All such remarks should be made on the record by raising your hand through Zoom. Chat should only be used to alert us to any technical difficulties you are having or to state in writing information like an email address that was already stated aloud on the record during the meeting. When a committee member is given the floor to speak, I will identify you and you can unmute yourself so that you can speak. We are required by executive order to create a verbatim transcript of the meeting, so please keep your questions and comments succinct and germane to the discussion. And so the order of the adopted agenda will be followed, and we will start with a presentation by Samuel Stein, who authored a report that looks back on the legacy of the de Blasio administration housing policies. The report was produced in collaboration with the Community Service Society, the ANHD Center, Make the Road, Mutual Housing Association of New York, and Vocal NY. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Sam, who will talk about this report. And we'll have a Q&A afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corinne, and thank you, Cody, for inviting me. Good to see the members of the committee here and to speak to the members of the public that have joined as well. I've been told that there might be some audio issues with my computer, so if at any point anybody's having trouble hearing, please let me know, but I'll do my best to speak up. I'm going to speak today about a report, as Corinne said, that was released by the Community Service Society last month. For those who don't know, the Community Service Society is over 175-year-old New York City institution whose mission is to combat poverty in all its root causes. And I work as a policy analyst in the housing division, assessing what's working and what's not, and advocating for policies that will benefit low-income New Yorkers and help solve the perpetual housing crisis our city has felt. And so as part of that job, I worked with the organizations Corinne mentioned to produce this report. And the process was that we kind of met together and talked through the last 7 years, what worked and what didn't work for the people that we represent. And there are various organizations with different constituencies. ANHD represents community development corporations for the most part. Make the Road New York is an immigrants' rights organization. Vocal New York represents homeless New Yorkers. The Center for New York City Neighborhoods represents working class homeowners. So we all have different vantage points and could sort of add different expertise. And my task was to pull it all together. And I'm going to put in the chat a link to the report, which maybe can be shared with everybody on the committee so that you can see the full thing. I'm going to share my screen now. Bear with me one moment. Okay, can I get confirmation that that worked? Okay, looks like it worked. All right, so the report is titled Assessing de Blasio's Housing Legacy. Why hasn't the, quote, most ambitious affordable housing program, unquote, produced a more affordable city? And so, like I said, our task was to assess what worked and what didn't work, and to kind of square the circle that is the de Blasio housing legacy. It is by no means untrue that this was an extremely ambitious affordable housing program, and that the rate of development of new affordable housing outpaced previous mayors for generations. But it's also true, as most people living in the city know, that the city has not become affordable to most people. In fact, it remains unaffordable, and housing is kind of one of the key issues facing our city. Homelessness remains a crisis. And so we were trying to understand how it happened. I'm going to take you through 9 charts that show some of the data behind the argument, but the basics of the argument were that, first of all, many things were accomplished, but the losses at least kept pace with the gains, if not outstripping them. Second, there was a real division between different housing types, between the needs of public housing residents, homeless residents, and the sort of rest of the city at large, which had a real different emphasis and ended up competing for both attention from key political officials and money. And second, that there was a overemphasis on top line numbers instead of an emphasis on where the real need in the city was and prioritizing the programs that work the best. And so big numbers were reached, but the impact doesn't quite live up to those numbers. But now I'll take you through some of the nitty gritty of the argument, and I'd love to get into it more in the Q&A. So the first thing we do is sort of establish that COVID has made the housing crisis worse by many measures, but that we were already facing a pretty severe crisis as of February 2020. And these figures come from a report we put out right at the beginning of the crisis that was called A Sudden Shock to an Overburdened System, New York City Housing and COVID-19. And the argument we were making there was that the city was sort of primed to go into a crisis when a shock like COVID-19 hit. And I should say that that brief was written by my coworker, Oksana Marinova, with Tom Waters, who is my predecessor at the Community Service Society, who died of COVID early in the crisis. So this was the last work that he published. And you'll see here that from our survey of low-income New Yorkers done in the summer of 2019, 30% were falling behind on rent. 20% had seen utility shutoffs, 19% were living in overcrowded conditions, and 15% were threatened with eviction. So these were already fairly stark numbers before the COVID-19 crisis hit.
Sam?
Yes?
Could you zoom in a little bit so it's everybody can really see these slides? There you go.
Okay, I've lost my own notes, but I think I can do it from memory at this point.
Okay.
So there's that the slide showing some of the conditions as of the summer 2019 for low-income New Yorkers. Next, to look at the accomplishments of the administration in terms of producing affordable housing. As promised in his campaigns, the de Blasio administration achieved record levels of affordable housing investment and production. So it was record levels in terms of the money that was committed, and it was record levels in terms of the units that were produced. Produced is a word that means both new development or new construction and the preservation of affordable housing that would otherwise have become unaffordable. And we broke it out here by AMI bands, area median income, as I'm sure the committee is familiar with these kind of standard breakdowns of 0 to 30, 31 to 50, 51 to 80, 81 to 120, 121 to 165, and then other. And you'll see that there was not exactly an even distribution across incomes, and that also there's not an even distribution of preservation in new construction. There was by far more preservation than there was construction, which isn't necessarily a problem, but is worth noting. You see the bulk of the new production concentrated in the middle of the graph in that low-income group of 50 to 80% AMI. And we note that that is a shift from the Bloomberg administration, which produced more affordable housing in the 80 to 120 or even 120 to 165 than de Blasio did. And that's a worthwhile shift. But it's not quite as big a shift as it appears, in part because the calculation for AMI changed between the two administrations, which sort of distorts the numbers. And then, as we'll see in the next, it still wasn't reaching the people who are most in need of new affordable housing. So in this chart, which is a recreation of a chart that was made in a controller's report in 2018, we see the difference between the numbers of affordable housing units that are promised by the administration, and I will say they are meeting their promise, and the amount of units that are needed within an income bracket. And what we mean by need here is people who are extremely rent burdened are paying more than 50% of their income in rent, people who are doubled up into overcrowded conditions, and people who are in homeless shelters or in the homeless system. And so, you know, if we look at the last chart, this is a little bit more impressive in terms of showing the distribution of incomes being met by the affordable housing production. If we look at this chart, we see that, in fact, the city planned to overproduce compared to need for people in the low income, moderate income, and middle income categories, while severely underproducing housing for the extremely low income and low income populations. So there was far less housing going to the people who needed it most, both in terms of the sort of severity of need, but also in terms of the number of people who needed it. This next chart looks at the geographic distribution of affordable housing production. And you see a couple patterns. The first is that the borough with the largest number and percentage of affordable housing is the Bronx, which was already the most affordable of the boroughs and has by far the lowest incomes. Meanwhile, Staten Island, which is the highest or one of the higher income boroughs and has very little affordable housing, only saw 1% of the affordable housing production. Manhattan did see a fair amount, as did Brooklyn. Queens saw, again, very little. And so Queens and Staten Island have the most suburban areas within them, and they saw the least amount of affordable housing development. So it was basically concentrating the affordable housing where there is already affordable housing, rather than distributing it more evenly or perhaps more fairly throughout the city. This is kind of an interesting chart to look at and can be interpreted in a couple different ways. What it does is show rent burdens over time. Rent burden meaning the percentage of income that New Yorkers are paying towards their rents. If you look at the Housing and Vacancy Survey, which is conducted every 3 or 4 years by the city and is really the most comprehensive accounting of housing conditions and housing costs in the city, what you saw was that about midway through the Bloomberg administration, a majority of housing became unaffordable for a majority of New York City tenants for the first time. That happened in 2011 and then did not change. But we only have data from 2014 and 2017, so we don't have a ton of de Blasio era data. So to look at more recent numbers, we looked at the American Community Survey done by the census, done by the census every year. And so this shows the rent burdens according to that census count annually in New York City. And the green line is all tenants combined, and the blue line is low-income tenants, which is defined at under 200% of the federal poverty level. And what you see is that housing by this measure, if not by the Housing and Vacancy Survey, did become more affordable over time for New Yorkers as a whole. We went from 46.3% being rent burdened in New York City in 2014 to 40.9% being rent burdened in 2019. That's still a lot of New Yorkers paying too much for housing, but it's movement in the right direction. On the other hand, if we look at just low-income tenants, we see an extremely high proportion are rent burdened at the beginning of the de Blasio administration, 72.3%, and it barely budges by the end of the administration, 71.5%. And if you look at extremely rent burdened New Yorkers, people paying more than 50% of their income in rent, the low-income population actually went up in terms of the percentage that was extremely rent burdened from 2014 to 2019. So what we appear to see in this data is a separation where even if the city as a whole is becoming slightly more affordable, the city is just as unaffordable as ever, or even worse so for low-income New Yorkers. One of the most important things that the de Blasio administration did for rent-stabilized New Yorkers was to appoint members of the Rent Guidelines Board who, in our assessment, were much more fair in interpreting the data and in assessing how overburdened the previous Rent Guidelines Board determinations had been in the favor of landlords. And so you see here the pattern of mandated rent increases by the Rent Guidelines Board over time from 1994 to 2020. The blue line is 2-year rent increases. The green line is 1-year rent increases. And again, as I'm sure you're familiar, every year the Rent Guidelines Board meets and determines the rent change for rent stabilized housing, as well as for SROs and some other forms. And they issue a guideline for 1-year increases or 2 years, and the tenant can choose which lease they want to sign. It's kind of a game. You're trying to figure out which is going to be better and what are they going to do next year. As you'll see, there's sort of a fluctuation up and down, but it stays in the range of 2 to 9% rent increases. That 9% rent increase under Mayor Bloomberg is really somewhat astonishing, coming in, I believe it's 2008, possibly 2007, right before a major crisis. You see a real leveling off under the de Blasio administration with rent freezes for the first time in the Rent Guidelines Board's history for 1-year leases, and lower rent increases than previous for 2-year rent increases. So this is a substantial change. We believe it's a fair change, and it's one that we advocated for and want to see move forward. And so it's important, even as we critique the de Blasio administration on their affordable housing legacy, to point out this is a significant change from his predecessors. Next, we move into the subject of rezonings. And in this report, we looked at two kinds of rezonings: city-initiated rezonings and developer-initiated rezonings. As, again, I'm sure the committee is well aware, one of the signature housing policies of the de Blasio administration has been mandatory inclusionary housing, or the policy that when the city upzones a neighborhood, a percentage of the new housing is income targeted with various options available to developers or council members in terms of how to interpret that. We did an analysis that I think has been done many times over of which neighborhoods were chosen for city-sponsored rezonings that would fall into mandatory inclusionary housing. And you see here the first set of rezonings up until this year. And you see it's East New York, East Harlem, Inwood, Jerome Avenue, Far Rockaway, and Bay Street. And if you look at the demographics of those neighborhoods, all of them are majority people of color. They are also all below the median incomes for New York City. And so this program is basically choosing working class majority people of color neighborhoods as the areas that would have to absorb a great deal of the city's growth, and only a minority of the new housing would be affordable. And much of it was not affordable to the residents of those communities. The affordable housing that's produced through MIH is not affordable to a majority of Black, Latino, and Asian New Yorkers citywide, including in these neighborhoods. This is kind of a well-worn trope at this point. I think a lot of us recognize that this was the case, and the recent proposed rezonings of Gowanus and Soho NoHo are a kind of marked departure from this. Whether or not you think they're good or bad, they're certainly different. What is maybe a little bit more original a contribution is this analysis of project level MIH rezonings, or rezonings that are proposed by a developer. And we looked at the data and found 73 instances of a rezoning that was initiated by the developer rather than the city, but was approved by the city, that triggered mandatory inclusionary housing. We were able to get project level data for 70 out of 73 of these individual rezonings. And we overlaid them onto this map to show the number of rezonings in those areas. And that's the size of the dot, with bigger dots representing more rezonings and smaller dots representing fewer rezonings. And a color coding for the percentage of the affordable units that were created through these rezonings that would be affordable to the average local resident, right? So the lighter colored areas are areas where almost all of the affordable housing is affordable to the average local resident. The darker red areas are the places where virtually none of it would be affordable to the average resident. And so what you see here, again, there's a lot of data here and it can be interpreted in a few different ways, but you see a lot of red and a lot of orange, which suggests that in a lot of these developer-initiated rezonings, they were not producing affordable housing that was affordable to the local community unless there was some additional subsidy added, like a Section 8 voucher or something like that. And so neither the market rate housing nor the affordable housing would be affordable in these areas. And you also see that the dots are a lot bigger, for the most part, in the areas that are less well matched. So in the west side of Manhattan, where I live, there was a small number of MIH rezonings, I think 1 or 2. And there you can say that the affordable housing would be locally affordable, but that's really a small number compared to the community districts in the Bronx, which are entirely in the deep red zone of 0 to 20% of the affordable housing being locally affordable. So I think this is my personal favorite of the slides. Not favorite because I'm proud of what this says about our city, but I think it's an original contribution that shows that it's not just that the city is sort of choosing the wrong areas for their MIH rezonings. The developer-initiated ones aren't doing any better. And if I remember offhand, I can't see my notes right now. I think what we found was that 75% of the quote-unquote affordable housing that was produced through these developer-initiated rezonings was not locally affordable. Okay, next, this is a graph that looks at housing quality over time. And the figure is low-income households reporting 4 or more housing deficiencies. So this is really bad housing. And the source is the Housing and Vacancy Survey, and we look over a long period of time from 2002 to the most recent survey in 2017. And what we find is kind of a great divergence, where private housing, whether it's market rate or rent stabilized or even subsidized private housing, is getting better over time in terms of the percentage of low-income households reporting these kinds of deficiencies, with private housing that is not subsidized seeing the biggest change. And then we see public housing going in the opposite direction, almost doubling in the percentage of low-income households facing 4 or more serious housing deficiencies, going from 11% in 2002 to 21% in 2017. So we saw a real escalation in the deficiencies in public housing that are both in terms of the quality of the housing and the sufficientness of the funding. And those two things are closely aligned. When the money is not there, the repairs don't get made. For whatever other problems NYCHA may have, they are also being starved of funding. And we saw the capital needs for NYCHA explode 400% between 2014 and the present, 400%. And so, all the stuff I talked about before was in the private housing stock, things not really being met, but there was this serious expansion of affordable housing production, and there were these rent freezes, which do make a difference. But then you see this, and you see that public housing is moving in an entirely different and really stark direction. Oh, that was my last slide. So I did not have a slide on homelessness, but that was the other major focus of this report, showing that over the de Blasio years, the number of homeless New Yorkers did not abate. Under the Bloomberg years, the number kind of exploded, and then under de Blasio, it continued to stay high, came down a tiny bit in the last year, but that gain was almost certainly wiped away by COVID and the insecurity of housing that's been attached to it. So, the ultimate housing issue in New York is homelessness, and it has not been solved despite the ambitions and the real gains of the de Blasio administration. So this report was all about sort of what went wrong and also what they got right. And it was meant to set up the organizations that we talked about at the beginning to release another report, which we put out just 2 weeks later. And that's called Right to a Roof. And that's a platform that says, okay, here's what worked and didn't work under de Blasio. Here's what we want to see moving forward in the next administration, whoever it is. And it's a mix of demands on mayoral candidates as well as city council candidates. And it pulls directly from the assessment we have here. If public housing, private housing, and homelessness were treated separately under this administration, we want to see a unified housing plan under the next administration that looks at them comprehensively. If the income targeting in this administration left out the largest need for the city, we want to see those groups prioritized in the next administration's housing plan. If public housing was starved of resources, we want to see a real plan to bring in resources and also to involve NYCHA residents more in the planning and in the financing decisions that are going to happen within NYCHA. So I urge folks, if you're interested in sort of what do we think should happen next, to check out that Right to a Roof report for a fairly in-depth look at how we can turn the city's housing agenda in a different direction. I will stop there. Thank you again for inviting me, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much. Figure 8 is also my favorite map. I really think it really brings home, without reading 50 pages and understanding what AMI is and MIH, exactly what happens. And that these units are basically going up in areas where they're more expensive than the existing units. Which brings me to my personal first question, which really goes down into the weeds. But you know, the AMI issue, and you know, it's mentioned a lot in the report. And you know, our community board has written a reso in support of HR 4984 that Yvette Clark put out to try to change the math around AMI. I don't think it's, you know, I'm not quite sure where it is. I looked it up and it's not, I think it's just kind of sitting there. But I'm just curious what your solution, you know, you think as a solution would be to that AMI issue that constantly pops up with it just kind of not like you mentioned, it's mentioned in the report, like you base the whole a lot of the housing costs, and developers base it on AMI, and then 2 years later when the building's actually finished, the AMI has just changed. And the problems that creates, and just how skewed the AMI is, like it represents too big of an area.
Yeah, that's right. So as it sounds like you've all grappled with this before, the area median income is not the neighborhood or the city, but the entire region with multiple counties counted, and it is fairly skewed. We have a case study that Corinne is referring to in the report that looks at a particular development in the East New York area of Brooklyn. And that's the one where in the time between, was that a hearing? Yeah, okay. I'll bring the computer uncomfortably close to my face, but it should be better sound-wise. In the years between when the project was approved and when it was actually built, the AMI had been adjusted and really no longer fit the local area anymore. And the point of that case study was to show that nonprofit developers are willing and able to kind of adjust the project to meet that reality in a way that for-profit developers are far less likely to. And it's not that they can't, they just don't. That's not their model. They're not mission driven. They are maybe profit plus mission driven in a way that nonprofits aren't. And another major part of this analysis in the report is that the de Blasio administration, like the Bloomberg administration, favored for-profit firms in the production of not only housing in general, but affordable housing. So all of that is to say, there are creative ways to get around the AMI problem, and perhaps it's more important to focus on what percentage of AMI we're building towards in our term sheets are targeting. Term sheets being the sort of program set by the city that developers can use to guide their work, than it is to change AMI altogether. Partly this is a kind of regional inequality problem that changing the AMI doesn't fix. And so being more targeted about who we really want to serve can have the same function as making a more locally targeted AMI. That said, we have, data at the local level. So it's not like the data doesn't exist to make a local AMI. But if we're not getting the kind of response we need from the federal government, there is plenty that can be done by the city. And sometimes I think the city can use as an excuse the fact that they don't control AMI, when what they do control, which is what really matters, is what percentage of AMI is being targeted in a particular program.
Thank you for that answer. And I will have one more question, and I'll open it up to the rest of the committee and the board members. What do you think? Like our district. Oh, yeah, Cody, could you put up the slide of our just the stats of CB6? Almost forgot about that. So, CB6 lost has lost over 6,500 units of rent stabilized housing. I don't count the Stuytown preservation as numbers gained. I just find that math not quite genuine. Yes, and clearly in our district we have a lot of rent burdened residents, even though this is considered like a higher socioeconomic neighborhood. So bearing that in mind, what do you think a neighborhood like ours could do to assist with building more affordable units?
It's a good question, and it's such a disturbing number to look at all of these loss of rent stabilized units between 27 and 2020. I mean, it really shows how important the rent law reforms of 2019 were in making sure that this can't happen anymore. So one important thing is to defend those reforms. There is a lawsuit that has been filed to challenge not only the 2019 rent laws, but the kind of foundation of the rent laws themselves, which is moving forward. And I'm in the process of writing an amicus brief arguing for the preservation of the rent laws. But the filers want it to go all the way to the Supreme Court, which, if it were accepted, might not be to the benefit of rent stabilized tenants. So protecting those rent laws and speaking up in support of those rent laws is important. In terms of development of new affordable housing, of course, there are zoning questions, and I don't know whether if there was MIH in your area, it would fall into. I know there hasn't been. The rezoning was commercial only. It's pretty shocking. But if there were to be, I don't know if your area would fall into the area where it would be locally affordable. But if it is, signaling support for that instead of only commercial development could be useful. And really, I think there is an idea that neighborhoods in core Manhattan don't want affordable housing, and that's then used as a sort of excuse for not bringing affordable housing programs into those areas. They say, oh, they'll face resistance, local resistance. If the community board can make affirmative statements that no, affordable housing is a crisis here too, and we want preservation and development of affordable housing, then it makes it harder to kind of let that case go. So I would encourage the community board, and I'm sure it already is, but to be vocal about that and not to let the kind of assumption that you wouldn't want affordable housing rule.
Great, thank you. Rich, do you have a question?
I do have just a quick question, which is, when looking at the fact that MIH, mandatory inclusionary housing, hasn't been that successful in creating the kind of housing we want. Can you compare it to the effect of the voluntary inclusionary housing that was in effect under the Bloomberg administration in terms of what it achieved?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I can't do it in a rigorous way. But voluntary inclusionary housing also didn't produce a lot of affordable housing, and certainly produced less over the span of 12 years than de Blasio's did under the span of the last 7 years. I think the broader point is that neither of these programs produced affordable housing sufficient to the need or in the places that needed it. There was a study that was done at the end of the Bloomberg administration. My memory says that Brad Lander might have been involved in it. I'm not totally sure. That showed the areas where inclusionary housing was built on a voluntary basis. And I think they found that there was like a significant number in Hell's Kitchen and in Williamsburg. Neither of those two neighborhoods are the most affordable, and the affordable housing in Hell's Kitchen where I live is it's rent stabilization and it's HDFCs. It's really not these 80-20 buildings that accounts for most of it. Williamsburg, of course, is not a bastion of affordability either. So even in the areas that saw the most growth, it hasn't been particularly effective. Of course, making it mandatory was better than making it voluntary, but the way that people envisioned mandatory inclusionary housing when it was being advocated for in the first place was a blanket over the entire city. It was not supposed to be this sort of rezoning by rezoning fight, because we understood that if it was, it would have more to do with the political power of individual neighborhoods and the inequities of the city, where basically these neighborhoods that got the city-initiated rezonings were neighborhoods that felt they needed something else from the city that they weren't getting. So it became a trade-off where, okay, yeah, I'll take the rezoning, but I'm going to get that school, I'm going to get that park, I'm going to get that transit, whatever it is that we feel that we need. Whereas the neighborhoods that felt that they were getting the services they needed before didn't feel any pressure to accept a rezoning. So what it should have been, and what it perhaps could be in the future, is a blanket over the entire city rather than this sort of bargaining process of neighborhood by neighborhood rezoning.
Thank you, Sam. And actually, I know that our land use chair, Adam Hartke, is also here, and he has a question about the comprehensive planning that the blanket that you're talking about. Adam,
I'm here, Corinne. However, Anju had her hand raised first, so I defer to her.
Okay, we'll do Anju first.
Sorry.
Yeah, either way. Thank you so much, Sam, for coming and presenting. I actually had a question on the Right to Roof report that you had released. You had mentioned this, obviously doing this ahead of the mayoral elections as well, to see how the candidates themselves would respond to the recommendations from the report. Can you speak a little bit on how candidates, if you're allowed to say who was receptive to the recommendations of the report, or if you did like a forum or a kind of a scoring to see like how their platforms align to what the recommendations were? We'd just be curious to see just how receptive our candidates are to what's been recommended.
It's a totally fair question that I'm going to have to dodge. So as a 501c3 organization, not only can we not endorse candidates, right, we can't like rank them on a score that's clearly linked to what we think they should do. So we have released the report, and I will say that we held an educational briefing for candidates and staffers where they could sort of anonymously join and ask questions, because we also didn't want it to be, we didn't want anybody to feel like if they asked what they think is a dumb question, their candidacy would be questioned. So it was anonymized, but we did have very good participation in it, I can say. And I leave it up to the board members to decide which platforms match most closely the platform that we put out there.
That's fair. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Anju, for that question. Yeah, so Adam, because I also really want to hear Sam's answer on to your question. So there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. Corinne, thanks for having me. Sam, wonderful presentation. Like Corinne said, I'm chair of the Land Use and Waterfront Committee, and in our committee and in the Strategic Planning Committee, we've been talking a lot about the proposed comprehensive plan that City Council proposed way back in December, and it's had a fair amount of hearings and back and forth on. So my general question is have you had a chance to take a dive, deep, or skim the surface? And sort of what are your general thoughts? And do you believe that this is right's the wrong way? Do you think that this is an effective mechanism to help increase housing, where to kind of fill the gaps that underneath the de Blasio era? And I know you said you dodged the last one, but if this doesn't, if you don't feel this is an efficient sort of vehicle to sort of achieve those ends, what would you recommend?
I can actually be less dodgy on this one.
Oh, man.
This is not a political candidacy. And in, well, I guess, whatever, I'm not going to get into the politics of it, but the Right to a Roof report makes several kind of core recommendations and then has a million sub policies of how you would actually do that. One of the core recommendations is to move toward a comprehensive planning process. And so we looked at the proposal that was put out there, and I think it's not perfect, but it's a step in that direction. And so we want to see it. We want to see it taken seriously, right? We don't want to see it dismissed out of hand, and we want to see it improved. And I think a better job could have been done in building this with community support and with the support of community boards that want to be involved in comprehensive planning. There's this tension, which is, I think, both real and exaggerated, between community-based planning and comprehensive planning. And ideally, what we want to see is both. I think the rollout and development of this plan could have been done better to include more community boards in the process early on, rather than kind of shopping it around after the fact. I would say that the process that has been described is interesting, is worthwhile, is contradictory, but that those contradictions are somewhat inevitable, right? So that it tries to do many things at the same time in ways that really need to be ironed out. And so I'll get into some detail, but if this were passed, I think we would see at least another year of debate, would be a kind word, and maybe struggle, a more accurate one, over how exactly this would be done. And I think that might be the role, if this does pass, that community boards should be very much engaged in. So, for example, the plan seems to want to both make sure that the city's growth is more evenly distributed without making actual mandates on areas for growth or preservation, right? So it kind of wants to do both things at the same time. It wants to even out the responsibility for planning and in some ways centralize it within the mayor's office through the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, while still maintaining a role for not only community boards, but council members to probably still have local control. So it kind of like does opposite things at the same time in ways that I'm not sure how they would work out. But that's the thing that needs to be debated around the city. Which value do we want to put forward? Do we want it to be, I think there are things in the city that can't be done on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis, including climate planning, right? We can't have every neighborhood for itself climate planning. On the other hand, there's a lot that can be done at the local level in terms of figuring out how we do climate planning, how we meet the needs of our local areas that we know the best. And so I'd like to see those details ironed out more. If I think about, like, if I was on the council, would I vote yes or no for this? Well, actually, that might be stepping into territory.
Yeah, we don't want you to violate.
Yeah. So rather than say that, what I really think, and this is maybe more as an individual, but I think still fits with my work at the Community Service Society, is that the system we have right now is unjust and inequitable. The system that's being proposed is not necessarily just or equitable. It's what system do we want to be fighting for justice and equity in? And I think there is more room for positive change in the system being proposed than in the status quo that exists right now. I think that's the most honest answer that I can give. Not that this will be the path to an equitable planning system, but it's a better terrain to fight for an equitable planning system on than the patchwork system we have right now.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
It's great. Thank you. We have some questions from members of the public, and I'll start with Dawn Davis has her hand raised. And you're permitted to speak, Dawn. Give her a second. Okay, I'm just gonna move on to, oh, what's up? To another member of the public, and if Don, and I'll try Don again. And this is a question from, I'm sorry, I can't see her last name, Diane F. She's unmuted. You're unmuted and can ask a question, Diane.
Diane appears to be muted on my screen.
Yeah, okay.
They have the ability to speak. They both have to unmute themselves and ask their questions.
Yeah.
Or they could type their questions in the Q&A feature and we'll read them aloud. In the meantime, Corinne, it looks like Abby has her hand raised.
So yes, we'll move on to Abby.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sam. This is super interesting. I was curious, you mentioned the multiple constituencies that you brought together initially, like Make the Road, ANHD. I'm wondering if you were all more or less on the same page while writing the Right to Roof report, or if there's sort of significant fault lines you had to work through there that we might encounter in the future dealing with multiple constituencies around affordable housing policy.
I really like that question because I'm always looking for the conflict in things that appear to be smooth. So I respect that. I'm not going to name groups in my answer, but I'd be happy to talk about the places there was, if not disagreement, different ideas about how to go forward. I think the area that needed the most massaging was around NYCHA and how to respond to the proposals for specifically RAD and the blueprint and what we think about them. So I think there was fairly universal commitment to keeping public housing public and different ideas about what that actually meant. There was universal commitment that the city and state should be paying more into public housing, and certainly that the federal government should. There was not universal agreement on whether the mechanisms that have been proposed in the past year, specifically the blueprint for NYCHA, accomplish that, or whether they don't. And I think this reflects a debate that's happening within public housing as well. So I showed some results from our annual Unheard Third survey of low-income New Yorkers. For the last few years, it's regularly shown a fairly even split of support and objection, and strong support and strong objection to the proposals for change that have been brought to NYCHA. So this is a live debate. And I'll say for our part, I think we were supportive of the concept of the blueprint, but believe that it should have been developed with more NYCHA resident participation and perhaps not dropped during the middle of a pandemic. But that it represented a significant shift away from the way that the RAD program is going about bringing money into the system. There was not necessarily disagreement, but we had to work through what we really thought around the question of quantity versus affordability. The fact that if you dedicate the same amount of money to producing more deeply affordable housing, as in housing targeted to lower income groups, you are dedicating more subsidy to fewer units. And are we okay with that? Are we okay with saying maybe we won't hit 300,000 units of affordable housing produced, but the ones that we produce are going to be affordable to the people who are really not being served by the available options? Or should we say we don't accept that premise, that there are efficiencies that can be found? There are programs that are funded in the city that maybe don't need to be funded at the levels that they are, and we can simply dedicate more funding, even though the levels dedicated under this administration have already been historic. But that was something that we had to grapple with for sure, and there were groups that were more and less willing to make that statement. Those are the couple that come to mind immediately.
Thank you. Just for anybody who's interested, NYCHA is is having some webinars about their blueprint for NYCHA, which I'm going to attend because I'm foggy on it. We do have one pact conversion in CB6, so we're very familiar with the whole process. And it's very controversial, and it's very hard to get people on the same page and when it comes to these privatizations. So it's definitely a sticking point. I would just want to see if either Don Davis or Diane are now on and able to talk. Don, you want to go first if you can? Diane? Okay. I'll have, I have an entire list of questions, but I'm the housing chair. But, one of the things that you mentioned in the report that I'm not 100% sure I agree, that I want to hear more about is like, yes, the siloing is a problem, but homeless issues a lot of times are not just housing issues. Housing is a health issue, and so I understand that, but at the same time, by the time somebody is homeless, they're dealing with so many mental health issues as well, or substance abuse issues. Like maybe it should be siloed, because it's just two different things.
Well, I think, first of all, certainly not all homeless people are experiencing either mental health crises or substance abuse issues. And there's a cause and effect there, as I think you're suggesting, that being homeless can drive you into substance abuse or cause a mental health crisis also. But we saw the numbers of homeless folks rising. So clearly the crisis of affordability overall was driving the rising number of homeless people. Even as we were placing people out of shelters and into permanent housing, the number still went up because more and more people were being evicted and losing their housing. So in that sense, there's a direct connection. And I guess I'd also say, like, I kind of think all housing is not just a housing issue, right? So housing is unaffordable in part because wages aren't high enough. And housing is a community building issue and an environmental issue. And it's all connected. And that can be almost like a throw up your hands and what do we even do about it thing if we think about the entire world being interconnected. But I do believe that we have for too long treated homelessness as an issue that is to be solved primarily by the police and by social service provisions, whereas first and foremost, it's a housing issue, and we have formally a housing first model in New York City, but we don't do it at nearly the scale that people need. So we have vouchers available to homeless people to get them into housing, but the voucher level is nowhere close to the rent. We have a right to shelter.
Yeah, and then people don't accept the vouchers, so it's like, yeah.
So as we saw today, there's a major lawsuit right now about Section 8 vouchers being rejected. I think the rates of rejection for city FEPs, the city voucher around homelessness, are even worse. And so we need to increase the value of the voucher and go after discrimination in the housing market by landlords and by realtors. There's just no way out of housing that deals with it as a policing and a social service issue, even if you want to figure out what social services are needed to make housing the homeless work, right? So supportive housing is the model that does that most directly, where you have housing for folks who are formerly homeless that incorporate social services into the same building and right on site. I live right next to a substantial supportive housing facility right on my block. There's a few in my neighborhood. They do really good work. There's not nearly enough of them. The state is committed to building them, but has only built about half as much as they said they were going to build during the course of Cuomo's 5-year housing plan. So I think there's ways of addressing exactly the kinds of stresses that are put on homeless people, or in some cases, push people into homelessness, while also treating it as a housing issue.
Okay. Yeah, no, with I mean, I knew the numbers were terrible, but I saw on page 26, is it 26? You know, that there are only 1,448 supportive housing placements were done in 2018. I mean, that's just
it's a drop in the bucket.
Atrociously low.
We've got over 60,000 homeless New Yorkers now, which is double what it was in, I think, 2011. We were at 30,000. So this is a problem that's been in New York City for a long time, but it has gotten way worse in the last decade.
Yes, and yeah, we are. I mean, one of the agenda items that we're still working on is also kind of learning more about supportive housing, but also just kind of not, but also just housing for people with disabilities. And we want to, as a board, kind of understand the difference between what is this supportive housing and what is just housing for people with developmental or physical disabilities, and where can we also attract that into the neighborhood more. Anyway, well, thank you so much. Is there any other questions from anyone else? Great. Well, this was amazing. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. And let me just get So the second item on the agenda is the chair's report. I'm going to waive that report. Maybe Rich Mintz, our vice chair, wants to talk about some of the things we've been working on.
I mean, the only update that I feel like I should give to the committee is in two parts. One, we saw that the Housing Rights Initiative filed suit regarding voucher discrimination, which has come up earlier in this conversation. It's a significant lawsuit targeting a whole lot of stakeholders, including some with political power, who should know better than to do this. And I think it will spark conversation about the shortcomings in the voucher system over the next few weeks, which is good conversation to have. On the flip side, we had earlier been talking about considering filing a class action suit on behalf of tenants who were on the wrong end of shenanigans about starting rent amounts in newly constructed rent stabilized apartments. We did some spelunking in a couple of buildings in Community District 6 where we have reason to believe those shenanigans occurred. We were not able to find a tenant who would serve suitably as a class plaintiff. And so we are probably going to let that initiative go for now as a committee.
Thank you, Rich. Oh, that's the wrong. So the third is old and new business. I wanted to, and I wanted to welcome a new member, Neil Barclay. I believe he couldn't make it today. And that's about it. I see Abby, you have your hand up.
Yeah, sorry, Rich, I lost you a little bit there. Can you go over what you were saying again about finding a class plaintiff? I was very unclear what. Sorry.
We did a mailing to tenants in 2 buildings, and we had some correspondence with a couple of them, but we didn't turn up anyone who, according to Housing Rights Initiative, would be suitable as a class plaintiff. And because it takes some shoveling to do that work, and we have limited capacity, and we're also dependent on the office for a lot of that, we probably are not going to proceed. But that's a decision that we can revisit at any time. Housing Rights Initiative is still interested. It's just some work on our end to try to find somebody.
And what were we looking for specifically?
I am the wrong person to answer that. If Cody is on, he might be able to speak to that.
So I don't actually have the answer to that question. Housing Rights Initiative and I connected tenants who responded to our inquiry and then subsequently requested their rental history from the state. And I compiled those with Housing Rights, and we sent them to an attorney that they use to look into these further and determine who might be a viable candidate to be the lead on the class action suit. From what I've been told from Housing Rights Initiative, because of the confidentiality, I can't ask any more questions as to why the tenants that we put them in contact with were or were not suitable leads for the case. So our options, as Rich said, are to either send out another mailing, maybe in nicer weather, try to door knock or reach people outside their building and see if there's others in the building that, once we see their rental history and can connect them with the attorneys, might be a suitable candidate.
Okay. And the issue is rent overcharge?
Yeah, that's what they were looking at initially, that the first established legal rent for the building and for each of the units was set incorrectly with the state, and therefore every subsequent rent increase from the RGB was an increase over a principal that was set incorrectly, and they would be owed the back rent if they could prove it.
Okay.
Yeah, and the real estate, the owners of the buildings, receive tax breaks based on a certain amount of rent that they should be charging, but they're charging more. So they're getting a tax cut and they're still charging, overcharging.
And their public filings say that they're charging less, correct?
Right. No, it's just that nobody really. It's just kind of a rule that nobody looks at, other than.
Yeah, it all stems from the fact that the starting rent is set higher than it's legally allowed to be, and then the system just runs like clockwork from that on. because no one ever investigates whether that starting rent is inflated.
Mhm.
One of the biggest things that they were looking at was, according to the law, you can't set the legal rent for the first tenant at one of those, for lack of a better term, preferential rent, where like a new building will come online and will say like, we'll give you X months free and here's the net rent, but here's what you're actually paying. They can't offer that to the first tenant unless they are at the same time setting whatever that person is paying monthly to as the legal rent with the state. And they were giving them that incentive, but then setting the legal rent for that first tenant at the much higher rate, which is against the law.
Thank you for that question, Abby. It's actually it's just one of those really where, you know, the devil's in the details, and the developers and the landlords are just not kind of being on the up and up and hiding things in the paperwork. Okay, so if any of the members have any old or new business? Okay, then I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. I'm sorry, if there are no objections, we will adjourn the meeting. I don't need a second, sorry. If there are no objections, we will adjourn the meeting. Seeing no further business, this meeting is adjourned at 7:45 p.m.